Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and it's time for part 2 of this series that I'm starting about conjugate training. And I want to remind people this is just my perspective on it. This is my take on the philosophy and behind the way that it's done. And it's not necessarily indicative of how every coach out there who uses this method does it or how they do it at Westside Barbell or anything like that. This is just my take on it. Today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about the dynamic effort method or speed training. And this is all done as compensatory acceleration style training. And for those who don't know what compensatory acceleration is, I've done a lot of videos on that in the past. And that's the idea that to maximize muscle fiber recruitment and explosiveness, you want to lift a weight as hard and as fast as possible. Now, the dynamic effort method is a more specialized variation of that. And a lot of it revolves around accommodating resistance, which is using bands and chains to change your deceleration curve and to try to teach you to continue to accelerate all the way through. And it's done with relatively light up to maybe moderately heavy weights. The percentages are going to vary depending on what you're doing, with a certain amount of chain or band tension at the top so that the strength curve changes. And it can be done with lifts besides your classical lifts or variations of them, but usually it's done like in this sort of system with box squats of some type, with deadlifts, usually sumo, and then some sort of bench press. It's not to say you can't do it with other lifts, you absolutely can, but if you're trying to maximize speed strength on your specific classic lifts, this is the way you do it. So the things to keep in mind with it is that when you're dealing with the compensatory acceleration end of this is usually done with low reps. The reason for that is that you can't generate maximum force more than about 3 times inside of 1 minute. You simply can't do it. Your nervous system won't let you do it. There's a fatigue generated by doing so. So while you could do 8 rep or 10 rep sets, and you should generally lift those as fast as you can, especially on bigger exercises. And again, we've covered research about that in the past as to why that is, particularly in multi-joint exercises. You just can't get maximum bar speeds more than about 3 times. So there's a reason you do 2 to 3 reps mostly on this style of training. The other things that you do with it is very high set training, and that's multifold in nature. When you think about training volumes, a lot of times people would do something like 3 sets of 10 because that would give a very good training response in terms of total training volume. But that's also going fairly close to failure. And when you start looking at adaptative stress with normal tempo reps, usually only the ones that get you within about 5 reps of muscle failure have a training response. In the case of compensatory acceleration, everything has a training response because you're lifting the weight maximally, so you're reaching those upper threshold fibers, which is what happens when you get to about rep 6 or 7 on a 10 rep max. So what happens with this, when you're doing very high set training, let's say you're doing 10 sets of 3. That's actually 30 total reps. 30 total reps that are going to give you that upper threshold muscle fiber if the bar speed and the rate of force exertion is high enough. So that's going to give you the equivalent in terms of that of taking about 5 to 6 sets within 1 rep of failure. Now, if you're doing this with multiple exercises through the week, that is a lot of training volume. That's a lot of training volume, and that's getting you a lot of practice doing compensatory acceleration. Right? That's an enormous amount of training effect overall. In fact, if you don't go to the third leg of training, if all you had done is max effort training, this is going to be a lot more training volume every week than that is. And so therefore, this is going to give you a larger training response. So much so that a lot of lifters, when they first start doing this form of training, usually notice significant amounts of hypertrophy. And I've noted quite a few people over the years who've talked about that they noted when they started incorporating the high set dynamic effort training that they got a new hypertrophic response. They saw new gains, new muscle growth that they hadn't seen, particularly in things like their back, hamstrings, a lot of things like that. That's been noticed to be a considerable effect. So when you're looking at getting a lot of your training volume in for your base hypertrophy, a lot of your baseline hypertrophy on a system like this comes from the actual speed work. It comes from the actual speed work. The other thing that has to be noted is the amount of practice you get. All right, you get large amounts of practice with this on hitting first reps. Even if they're not exact replicas of your classic lifts, it's still getting set up under a squat bar, getting the bar set in position on your back, walking it out, Same thing on the bench. You're getting used to setting up your arch, getting tight, pulling everything in tight. Same thing on a deadlift. You're getting used to coming over, pulling slack out of the bar, getting your feet into position. So it gives you, again, significant amounts of practice when doing those. Now, the way that this stuff is usually loaded, it's usually loaded into 3-week waves. And it's not uncommon to change the tensions in those different waves. And like in my case, the way I do it, as you guys notice, I usually start with weights that are a certain percentage of my 1-rep maxes, estimated maxes. And I start with bands or chains, and then I add a small amount of weight each week in the 3-week wave. So if on the barbell squat, the box squat, I start with 275 plus bands or chains or whatever. The second week I'll go to 295, and then the next week I'll go to 315. Bench press, it's much the same. It's just smaller jumps because it's a lighter exercise. So if I start with 205, I'll go 205, then 215, then 225. So 10-pound jumps through the 3-week wave. And then after 3 weeks, you change the form of accommodation. So it could be like a 3-week wave of bands, followed by a 3-week wave of chains, and then back and forth. And that works very, very well because what you're doing is you're getting continual adaptation. So just like in classic periodization to where you're doing these things in 3-week blocks, these are essentially 3-week blocks of small amounts of linear progress because you're increasing weight. But then you completely change the training stimulus after 3 weeks. And it's because we tend to stall with any given training stimulus at about the 3-week mark with no matter what you're doing, unless you're a novice lifter. And it has to do partially with the biological law of adaptation. So by rotating through these every 3 weeks, you're getting a novel training stimulus. And because you probably slightly detrained each time, it gives you a new response. Because it takes you about 2 weeks to significantly detrain anything. And so since it's been 3 weeks, you guys get the idea. You're reacclimating to that curve again, and you get better and better at it over time. Now, the end result is that this sort of training teaches you to get fast. It teaches you to get explosive. It teaches you to drive through and accelerate as hard as you can. And it teaches you to do so with different loads because you're changing back and forth over time between things like bands versus chains, and you're adjusting the type of accommodation. What ends up happening is that you get used to accelerating maximally over and over and over, like up to 30 reps in a single workout on a given exercise. And you're doing it repeatedly so that you get used to just accelerating. And because you're doing it, again, with slight variations in weight through the waves, you're doing it with back and forth different forms of resistance that you're pushing against, you learn to just get fast and you learn to get explosive. And again, you're usually dealing with weights that are fighting you at the top. So it might be somewhat light at the bottom. You're building speed and then you're forced to drive through. And normally we decelerate at the top of lifts, right? We decelerate at the top of lifts. This forces you to have to try to accelerate, and it changes your deceleration curve considerably, which makes you generally more explosive on your big lifts. Now, the other side is that a lot of this, because you're doing things like bands, in some cases the bands pulling you down can train what's called an overspeed eccentric, in which it's trying to pull you harder than just a free weight would towards the ground, which initiates a larger stretch reflex when you start the concentric rep again. So a lot of times people won't pause on the band work on this. The other thing that's noted with the box squat, because of the way that you set up on a box squat, you're able to hold a stretch reflex for just a brief count. You're able to still get that stretch a little bit, even if you've paused on a box. So if you get a band pulling you down and then you have that, again, overspeed eccentric, you can drive back up. You can drive back up with more force as a result of it. The only downside, of course, of that, some people would argue, aren't bands better than chains in that regard? Well, no, not necessarily, because it's a different resistance. And the chains are slightly easier to recover from. Because of the overspeed eccentric sometimes associated with the bands, they can actually be a little harder on recovery. So you deal with them in a 3-week wave, and then you go over to chains, and then you fight against a different form of resistance. But the whole point of this training is to do very, very large numbers of low reps and generate as much speed and power and force as you can on every single rep. You're basically trying to explode the bar up, and you're doing so against usually accommodating resistance. And the idea of this is to develop speed strength, to develop the skill associated with it, because you're practicing it repeatedly, get a decent amount of hypertrophy, practice all your setups, and it helps you get faster. It helps you get a little bit thicker, and then it helps you get faster when you go over to do your max effort work on separate days. So this is the second leg in a conjugate style training. So far you have max effort, then you have dynamic effort, and then we'll finish up next time discussing the repetition effort method. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.